talking to you, and he was not a tall man, but like certain people who are short, he was not willing to bend his neck to look up to you. Jack was willing to bend his neck. There are certain people you meet who won't do that. He acknowledged you were taller than he was, and if you were showing him artwork, he treated you like an artist. And if you were showing him writing, he treated it like a writer. And if you were just someone who loved his comics, he kept saying, "Thank you, I thank you," over and over again, because he was very grateful to everyone who loved his work. And you could learn a lot being around him, and you just felt smarter and more creative. You might not be more smarter or more creative, but you felt that way in his presence. He never put people down. Marv has been nodding throughout this because he knows that that was the case. Folks, this is Marv Wolfman. I think you know what he's done. This is John Morrow, the publisher of the Jack Kirby Collector. Book I'll show you in a moment. This is Paul S. Levine, who has been the attorney for the Jack Kirby Trust and the Rosalind Kirby Trust, and also they keep changing the name of it. But he was a lawyer that I wish Jack had had 20 years earlier in his life. And on the far end is the eminent artist, Mr. Steve Lealoha. We're going to talk a bit about Jack, and we'll take questions later. John, why don't you show them what you brought?
Okay. It won't actually be in stores for about 2 more months. We just got some pre-release copies in just for the show. We did originally a Captain Victory graphite edition, which was this nice reprinting, presentation of Jack's first Captain Victory issues, but reproduced from his pencil art. And a few years later, we did a Silver Star graphite edition, which is all 6 issues of Jack's Silver Star reproduced from his pencil art. And here to continue the tradition, this one's really fun, Destroyer Duck graphite edition. It's in hardcover, it's beautiful, it's all 5 issues of Steve Gerber and Jack Kirby's really fun, crazy, and bitingly funny Destroyer Duck series. Mr. Evanier did the introduction for it, or the forward for it, which outlines the history of what was going on, and talks about his friend, Mr. Steve Gerber, who was one of the most unique and creative writers ever in comics. And in an interesting little twist, Mr. Lealoha here, I believe, did some beak corrections on Destroyer Duck in this.
Minor adjustments. Probably my major claim to fame was that I put little tiny rivets on the logo.
Oh, really? Well, good job on the rivets. Those are really nice. But,
very important.
Anyway, so that's down. That we have a few copies of it here at the convention. But this gentleman clued me in on all kinds of amazing things about Steve Gerber I didn't know, and so I'm just thrilled to death that we were able to get this thing produced. And Mark helped a whole lot on this book. So,
while we're on the subject, I'd like to clear up something. Mr. Lealoha, did you ink the cover of this comic?
I did not. It's amazing to me that people can't tell who this is, but there you go.
There is a self-proclaimed Jack Kirby expert who claims that Neil Adams did not ink the cover to this cover, even though the publisher, Dean Mulaney, watched him ink it, and that Steve Lealoha inked it, and that when Steve or I mention that Neil Adams did it, Steve and I are lying. We're covering this up.
I remember.
Apparently, he also thinks QAnon inked it also. I don't understand.
Neil also did the color, too. So.
And if I may, we've got Neil's original inked version in here, which is a little different than what was actually published. So somebody, I don't know if it was Steve. Wasn't me. Somebody did some corrections to it. Originally, Destroyer Duck's flippers had brass knuckles on them, and those got taken out somewhere along the way. So, but I agree, it's totally accurate.
I want to talk, but I asked my friend Marv to be here because Marv knew Jack before any of us on this panel. Tell us about going to Jack Kirby's house when you were younger.
Now, Jack was already, I guess, even when we were really young, it was Jack Kirby. He was the king. He was the guy who, when I was a kid and reading DC Comics and was reading the backup of, I forget, which one did Green Arrow appear in?
Adventure Comics, but it was also the world's finest for a time.
And was always bored by the Green Arrow stuff. But suddenly one issue, the first issue came, and there was this giant arrow that was like as big as a building and all this stuff, and I'm going, wow, wow. Had no idea because there were no credits. And next time I saw him was in Challenges of the Unknown, same type of art. Oh wow, this is unbelievable, you can't. That was Jack. So he was already big, he was already famous, and my friend John Levine called him and said, can we come up to see you? And he said, yeah. I mean, you just don't do that. We were too stupid to know that you don't do that. And Jack was wonderful, so, and said, sure, come on up. So we get there, and we see Jack for a second, and Roz, his wife, said, you can go down after. First, I'm going to make you lunch. What, kidding? Lunch was great.
Roz made good sandwiches.
Yeah. We went downstairs, and Jack was sitting at his drawing board and drawing the entire time. I have the memory, and I think I'm correct, that either that trip or the other one, the next couple, we watched him draw some of the Galactus trilogy, which was like the most mind-bending story we had ever seen in comic books at that particular time. It was like unbelievable. And Jack's talking to us the whole time while he's drawing. He'd look up occasionally. The thing about Jack's art, which was so amazing to me, because, you know, if you know his work, and you're here, so obviously you do, it's intricate.
That was Marv's Kane film. The platform is not coming on.
It's incredibly intricate, and you'd figure he would do a million sketches to make it all work because it's all these different levels of depth. He starts in the corner and draws downwards without any pre-drawing there. It was all in his head. It was like he was projecting the thing in his head. So he asked us, well, and we're just stunned. I mean, watching all this happen. And he asked us what we want to do, and I said, well, I'm publishing a fan magazine at the time, and I want to be an artist. And he said, have you come up with any ideas? And I said, yeah, I have an idea for this character. I mean, it was awful. And Jack listened to it and said, here's some ideas. He figured out in 5 minutes how to make that character better and work better, and it was incredible. It's like, oh wow, this is how do you do these things? And Jack did it with, you know, just did it because he saw that there was a struggling writer and he wanted to help him out. I was a kid, you know, I wasn't 25, I was about 14 or 15, and Jack did that. And then he said, would you like a drawing? And I have a beautiful picture of Thor, which I asked for, on my office wall, and has always been on my office wall, no matter where I'm working or where I'm living at the time, because it always came. That was Jack Kirby, willing to help out a kid, and did it to make it that story was going to be publishable. My idea would be good. Incredible, just incredible. And I miss the sandwiches.
And you probably thought at that time, eventually I'm going to be this man's editor-in-chief.
Sure, I knew that absolutely. Yeah. And what dream world do you live in?
I'm in WonderCon. Anything is possible.
Anything is possible.
I try to explain to people when they say, you know, I like John Buscema's Silver Surfer better than Jack Kirby's, which is fine. And Jack would have said, great. And if you told Jack, a kid went up to Jack one time and said, Mr. Kirby, you're my favorite comic book artist. And Jack said, thank you. And the kid said, well, after Gil Kane, of course. Now, there are artists who, if you said that to, they would deck you. They would just be real insulted. Jack would immediately say, Gil's fabulous. Gil's the best. You love him. He was not committed that way. But I sometimes can't convey to people that Jack Kirby did not do exactly the same job that John Buscema did. John Buscema, and any of those people, I'm using him as an example, his job was to draw a good-looking issue based on what the writer gave him and do the best job he could. Jack always approached every single story he did like, how do I take this to another level? How do I invent something new in here that other people can build on? And that's why his comics are so full of characters that can be spun off. He was always thinking of putting in somebody new. Look at how many characters who got their own series started in a Jack Kirby comic as a spirit carrier or a background player. And that must be something that, and Marv, you have had your hand in creating an awful lot of characters. Is that from Jack's influence?
In a way, yes, it was, because one of the thoughts that I had, let me backtrack. When I did the Teen Titans, everyone thought we were doing DC's version of the X-Men. And I'd keep saying, no, we're doing DC's version of the Fantastic Four. Because every issue of the Fantastic Four would have a brand new concept. There'd be all these incredible characters. So many characters came out of it, and he kept coming up with new ones and new ones and new ones and new ones. And that's what I loved as a fan. I said, I'm going to do as best as I can to do the same sort of thing. I'm not going to only use old characters that DC had. I'm going to keep coming up with as many new characters as they possibly can. And that was 100% the influence of Jack and Stan and the Fantastic Four.
When Jack was working for DC in the early 70s, you were one of his few allies on the staff there.
Yeah.
And
Same with Marvel.
yes, well, I think at one point the only two people that he felt were on his side of the company were you and Nelson Bridwell. And were defending him when people wanted to change stuff. And
I was the first person at DC to see the first issue of the New Gods, because I was an unpaid intern at the time on Summers, so you can tell how long it was, because I would not be an unpaid intern ever again. But they let me into their world, and one of my jobs was to open up the mail, this from the artist, not the fan mail, but the artist mail. And so the package came in from Jack, and I got to open it and just stare at it, because it was just gorgeous pencils. I mean, unbelievable. No inks, I guess. Just beautiful work.
And do you think it was appreciated in the office for what it was?
No, because it didn't look like a DC comic at the time. There was a very clear DC look, and it was Jack stuff shouted at you, and the DC stuff of the 70s, 60s and 70s sort of took you on a trip, but that's about it.
When my friend Steve Sherman and I went to DC the first time, we were there 10 minutes before Sal Harrison, who was the head of production there, sat us down and tried to get Jack to draw more like Kurt Swan. He thought that was the way comics ought to look, not that Marvel garbage, you know.
Yeah.
And I think if not for Marv and Nelson and not many other people out there, Jack would have been forced to draw more like somebody who wasn't Jack Kirby. Was that your observation?
I think they wanted Jack because the Marvel stuff was so popular, but they didn't understand his artwork, which is surprising to me because Carmine is a brilliant artist. Totally one of my favorites of all time, but he didn't get someone else's art that wasn't in the Dan Barry style. Dan Barry did the Flash Gordon comic and others comic strip, and he was sort of like the god of how to draw at the time, and the way DC drew at the time.
Yeah.
But everybody is dead, so we could say nasty things about them.
Yeah. And by the way, we should mention a lovely man named Joe Giella, who passed away last week. A guy who was in comics from 1945 until I'm gonna guess 2015 or so, 2010, something like that. As nice a man as you can get, meet, as nice a man as ever had the function of inking other artists and preserving their work, and he works very hard on that stuff.
Can I interrupt
yeah,
you for
sure.
a second about Joe? Having had the success of calling Jack and going to his house, we found out that Joe lived not far away from that. And so we called again, and again, yes, they had us come up. No sandwiches, though. But we got to spend the entire afternoon speaking with Joe about comics and art and all of that stuff. I don't remember any of it, unfortunately, my memory is bad. But we had a great time, and that was, again, here's somebody letting some kids into their house to talk about comics, which I'm sure he would have much preferred drawing or watching TV or something else.
Yeah, I learned in comics, I learned one thing, it's that inkers never give you sandwiches.
Why didn't you tell me? I would have eaten first.
You and I talked once, I have, in this book I'm actually going to finish about Jack, I have a long quote from you about why DC should not have been changing Jack's Superman.
Yeah, I don't remember what I said, but they shouldn't have.
Okay. Marv was one of the few in the office who advocated for leaving it alone. And you know, they didn't want to leave it alone. They didn't want to leave anything alone.
Well, Superman to them didn't look like Superman, despite the fact that Gil Kane's Superman didn't look like Wayne Boring's Superman, who didn't look like Joe Shuster's Superman. You know, so what?
Well, they weren't thinking of them as those artists' renditions. They were thinking of them as the approved DC version that DC Comics created.
Yeah, every company that I've worked for in one way has this term called on model, and certainly in animation where all the stuff should look the same. It doesn't matter where you are. Marvel, I have to admit at the time though, really encouraged individual looks to the different artists. And Stan to the different writers. He actually didn't want people copying his style. He wanted them to go off on their own and find it the same way.
Mr. Lealoha, how did you feel when you saw Jack Kirby's work being redrawn like that?
Well, as a young fan, I always found it disconcerting that it would be inked by Vinnie Coletta, and then there'd be a Murphy Anderson face. And they really did not match up. So it's just weird and wrong, but just really weird. It was, to me, it stood out like a sore thumb.
For those who don't know about this, the first things Jack did for DC when he went under contract to them, he drew the first issues of New Gods, Forever People, and Mr. Miracle in that order. And then he started on Jimmy Olsen. You always have to remember when you're talking about comics that they don't come out always in the order that they were done, and sometimes an issue that was drawn in January and an issue in July come out the same time in December. And so Superman was in the first Forever People, and it didn't bother them at that point when it came in. And then the Jimmy Olsen started coming in with Superman, and suddenly one day they said, these aren't right, we've got to fix this. It looks like a Marvel comic, and we can't have Superman looking like he's one of those lousy Marvel comics. So they had some people in the production department working with Vince Coletta, who was inking the stories, and they did a few pages where they fixed the faces. And they looked at this couple of pages and they went, this is not right, we can't put this out. They had done very lifeless, bad imitations of the Kurt Swan version, which they didn't think of as the Kurt Swan version. They thought of it as the official version. So Nelson Bridwell, who was assistant editor on these books, said, why don't we send them back to Jack to redraw? And that was heresy because at DC, the artists, the freelancers did not correct what the production department did. The production department corrected what the artists did. So they gave the books, the first issue of Forever People and the first two Jimmy Olsen's to an artist named Al Plastino, who was not drawing for DC at the time. They had taken him off drawing Superman because they thought his work was old-fashioned. I think he was doing the Batman newspaper strip at that moment. And so, well, we can't have Jack Kirby draw Superman that doesn't look like this. Let's get the guy who started drawing Superman in 1946 to fix it. And he redrew those 3 issues, pasted over or completely wiped out what Jack did and redrew it. Thereafter, you had, except for the 2 issues Mike Royer inked, you had some combination of Vince Coletta and Murphy Anderson. Sometimes Murphy fixed the pencils and then Coletta inked it. Sometimes Coletta inked the book and left Superman and Jimmy Olsen heads for Murphy Anderson to ink. Murphy Anderson was the guy who worked in the DC offices. He had a drawing board there, and he was tapped often to do art corrections that were beyond the ability of the production department. I was present at a San Diego con the first time Murphy Anderson came to one, and he had made a point of going to Jack Kirby and apologizing for that. Jack did not blame him. You only did what you were told to do. He understood that, Jack certainly knew about people who force you to do stuff in comics that you don't want to do. He had a lot of it in his life. And Anderson said, he was very relieved that Jack didn't blame him. And he said, if they had let me ink the whole book, it wouldn't have jarred so much, and I would have changed your work a lot less than they made me change the Supermans. He said that, and Murphy was a very nice man. You obviously had a lot of interaction with Murphy.
I worked with Murphy. The sad part was, the terrible story was when I was an assistant editor, we had to make changes over Murphy's John Carter for some reason. Joe Kubert wanted it differently, and redrew the faces on it. And I had to let Murphy know that his faces were changed. And Murphy was one of the biggest John Carter fans in the universe. I mean, he loved all the Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff, and it really was a crushing thing. But back then, they just changed everybody, and they didn't think of it as negative. That's just the way it was.
Now, John, you've been shepherding, since we're on the subject of the Superman heads thing here, you've been shepherding a lot of articles about that over the years. It is my observation that the tampering with Jack's work is now pretty universally regarded as an enormous editorial blunder.
Yeah.
Is that your opinion too?
Yes.
When you
I'm sorry, I'm still reeling from the fact that this man sitting next to me was, well, I know Mark saw New Gods #1 in pencil first, but Marv saw New Gods #1 in pencil first before anybody else in the offices, but he also watched him draw the Galactus trilogy. I'm just like, I'm not worthy. That's awesome.
You publish a lot of Jack Kirby's pencil art in the Jack Kirby Collector. What kind of reactions do you get from people when they see that and compare it, as they will all be often, to the inked versions?
Well, everybody loves Joe Sinnott and Mike Royer. Some people love Vince Coletta, some not so much. Some have grown to have a better appreciation for him, I guess. Back to Murphy Anderson, the whole thing of Murphy changing the faces, that intrigued me at one point, and we had a photocopy of an unpublished Jimmy Olsen cover that Jack did, and I got to thinking, well, and because I knew Murphy a little bit. I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's in Greensboro, which is an hour and a half from us, and he would regale me with stories growing up in North Carolina. And so I asked him, I said, Murphy, would you be willing to ink this unpublished Jack Kirby Jimmy Olsen cover so we can see what it would really look like if you had inked the whole thing instead of just the faces? And he said, sure. It was a beautiful combination. It's not like anything you've seen anywhere else. If anything, it's maybe a little bit like Kirby with Wally Wood because Murphy's style was so dominant, and like Wood's was. But I think just in general, people are just so thrilled to warts and all, see Jack's pencil art, see little things that did get changed and they can see them in the original pencil version. To me, that's the fun of this. When I found out, when we started this thing, I had no idea that Jack had years and years of photo pencil copies. Of course, Mark and Steve Sherman knew this because they worked with him and made, I guess you made the copies, right?
I made some of those copies, yes.
Yeah,
It was my great contribution to comics. And Jack Kirby's photostat machine for him. And actually, once or twice, the machine would jam. Roz would feed pages into it. It was an early machine that did 11 by 17. There were very few on the market at the time. And Jack got one of these things, and you fed the page in, and it went through around a roller. It actually bent the page around. And sometimes it didn't come out. And Roz would panic, and Jack would say, if it was a couple of days before Steve and I came out to work, Jack would say, just leave it for the boys, they'll take it. And Steve and I would do surgery, we'd dismantle the machine and try to salvage the page. And one time, now this will horrify you, there's a beautiful page out of New Gods, and it's all shredded, and ugly, and terrible. And I went to Jack and said, this is all we can do, I'm sorry. And he said, not a problem. And he just took the page, laid it there, picked up his paper, and drew. And he did not copy it exactly. He drew a new page that had the same information on it, but everything was in different places and probably a better page. But that happened.
And I think that's one of the fascinating things that, for me as a fan, you can see where he would self-reject a page, right? And redraw the same scene, but from a different perspective, or focus on a little more on different action in a different panel or something. It tells the same story, but the redrawn version is much better. And I guess what he just couldn't. Good enough wasn't good enough for him, right?
Jack wanted the comic to be. He wanted to be very proud of what left him, even if he knew it was going to be badly inked or badly colored. He probably objected to the coloring he got at DC more than the inking. He was important to him that he was satisfied with it, and he would every so often hand me a page, say, take panel 2 out, give me an eraser, erase panel 2. I tell people that Jack never really redrew because the drawing was bad. He redrew because the drawing was wrong. He wanted to do it from a different angle, or he wanted something different to happen in the panel. The pages, the drawings were all fine themselves. They just maybe didn't tell the story right, or he thought of something else that could be more exciting in that spot. And he was. I hate the term perfectionist because it usually applies to someone who's really annoying about making you change things their way. But Jack was a perfectionist in that he had to be happy with the work himself, and he was always proud of what he handed in, except maybe the last 6 months at Marvel. When he was really unhappy with the company and the way they were treating him. But it's nice to see John preserve all that stuff.
Well, there's one thing that last 6 months at Marvel, and Jack was not just adored by his fans for his artwork, but by fellow professionals. I know Herb Trimpe and Maurice Severin would photocopy his pencils in that same kind of machine you're talking about, and I think at least once Trimpe shredded a page and had to get Jack to redraw it. But Marie made copies of one of the last things Jack did at Marvel in 1969, which was a horror story for, what was it, Tower of Shadows? I forget.
Chamber of Darkness.
Chamber of Darkness. It was called The Monster. And Marie copied this when it came in because it was so beautiful, and she kept them, the copies in her own files. And 20 issues into the Jack Kirby Collector, I get a package in the mail one day from Marie Severin out of the blue. She says, I thought you might want these. Now Mark probably knew about this, and Steve, right? Because they're the insiders, but as a fan, I'm like, I did not know there was an entirely different version of this story. And I'm sorry, 10,000% better version of the story that Jack turned in, and it was this very heartfelt thing where at the end of the story, Jack and Stan pull these hoods off and you find out it's them narrating the story the whole way through. And with all that was going on at Morrow at the time, that Stan rejected that very sentimental ending. I mean, have you ever addressed maybe how much that particular rejection might have affected him?
This is absolutely true. The second time I ever visited Jack, and the first time Steve Sherman visited him, we went down to his house. He was still living in Irvine at the time. And it was the day after he had redrawn that story, and he showed it to us. He showed us the pencil pages for the redraw, and he said, last night I sat there and destroyed one of the best stories I ever did. And Roz had urged him. It was a 7-page story, 8-page story. It was a short story, but it was a really offbeat, sentimental story with some heart in it. And what happened was that, Stan gave him the assignment, and Jack came up with the story, and Stan sent it in because Stan was insisting on doing the dialogue on this stuff. And Jack asked, can I dialogue this one myself? I really love this story. And can I take out that stupid thing you wanted with us wearing hoods on it? Because Jack did not like being a character in comics. Or at least he didn't like being a character in a comic book copyrighted by Marvel. Because later they were claiming they owned his image. They were claiming that they had the right to put a Jack Kirby character in a comic and have him say, oh yes, Stan Lee thought of everything. Anyway, Stan was very busy at that time. He didn't care about a 7-page or 8-page mystery story. So he said, go ahead. They sent the pages back to Jack, and he dialogued the story, sent it back cross-country again, and then suddenly, to his surprise, it came back with notes to revise the ending and change the whole story. And he specifically said he didn't sign his name to it, but I'll bet this is Stan's decision. And he hated it. And Roz said, why don't you just leave that story alone and draw a new one? And he said no. And it was almost like to punish himself. He erased a good story and did he kept some of what was there he could keep. But Jack, one of the many things that drove Jack away from Marvel in the last year or two of his career there in '69 was they kept asking him to redraw stuff for which he was not paid. And he thought that the changes were gratuitous and sometimes very stupid. He was drawing an issue of Thor one time that would have led to the origin of Galactus. All of a sudden, someone calls him and says, oh, Jean Buscema is drawing a new... No, it was the origin of Silver Surfer. If I have this right. No, I'm combining two things here. He kept doing a story and they'd say, oh no, we're working on something else. We're doing the origin of Galactus in this other comic. We're doing the origin of the Silver Surfer in this new Silver Surfer book that we didn't ask you to draw. And he would wind up with pages he had already drawn that he couldn't send in and therefore couldn't be paid for. And that annoyed the hell out of Jack. And it happened time and time again. There were like 6 different cases in the last 2 years where he drew pages and then somebody told him, Fantastic Four number 100 was originally going to be a 40-page double-size issue. And Jack is halfway through drawing a 40-page story and someone calls him up and says, no, we're not going to do it that way. Get it down to 20 and 2.5 pages.
That is why it has so many 9-panel tiny pictures. Okay, that makes sense.
So, if Jack was doing a 20-page Fantastic Four story, they paid him for 20 pages. If he drew 20 pages, they sent them in, and then they made him draw 5 more pages to change it around. He was paid for 20 pages. He could not be, and it has infuriated him many times, and that was the case with that monster story. He had to draw the story, basically draw it twice to get paid for one job. And I remember Jack was really shaken by that. I mean, I was with Jack a few times when he was really very upset, very angry. One of the most was the time that he got the call they were going to suspend New Gods and Forever People. It was one of the saddest moments of my life, seeing how crushed he was by that. And then, next day he draws Commanding number 1, and he's Jack Kirby again. But it was very. I got too close to Jack at times in ways. I just started feeling his pain sometimes. It was very disturbing. Paul, you dealt with Jack a lot.
Yes.
In contracts.
So to react to what you said about you wish I had been born 20 years earlier so I could represent Jack 20 years before, I wish that as well. By the time I met Jack, it was 1982 or 1983. I was a brand new lawyer, fresh out of law school, working for a small law firm in Century City. It was my boss, Steve Rohde, and me. One day, Steve and Jack come to the door of my little tiny office, and Steve said, I want you to meet Jack Kirby. And I looked up from my desk and said, who? And Steve said, well, Jack is the creator of Captain America, Hulk, Fantastic Four, X-Men, etc. And I said to Mr. Kirby, I stood up, and of course he was standing too, and I stood up and he looked me up and down, and I said, well, Mr. Kirby, I have a confession to make. I never read Marvel Comics as a kid. I only read DC Comics. And by then, of course, he had long ago left Marvel and had worked for DC. I had no idea of some of the machinations that were going on while he was working for DC. Turned out he had come to the office because DC was about to merchandise a bunch of the characters that he had created, and he needed someone to, a lawyer to negotiate the deal with, turned out to be Paul Levitz at DC Comics. And I said, and so I told him that I had never read a DC comic, a Marvel comic in my life, and he smiled and he said, and he stuck his hand out and shook mine and said, "Kid, we're gonna get along just fine."
I was in a meeting with, remember the time that I came in, we had this strange meeting where we were trying to sort out some things, and Jack kept mentioning, Jack had you've heard Jack had a bad memory. He really didn't have a bad memory, he just kind of was operating on another plane at times. He was thinking 4 notches ahead of himself. And he would say, now this character came in Fantastic Four number 34. And I said, no, that was number 32. And I did it so often, he got kind of pissed at me.
But of course, I had no idea what was going on because I had just met you as well. At the end of the day, I know that Jack and Roz especially were pleased because this was the first time that he had ever received not only a percentage of the sales of the merchandise in question, but he got a signing bonus. I got him a nice little, but at the time, significant amount of money just to sign the contract. And that cemented my relationship with Jack and Roz for the rest of my time at that law firm.
Yes. Paul is very good at this type of stuff. He represents me now, full disclosure. And just made a great deal we can't talk about. Right. Yes. Steve, let's get you back into this.
Sure.
You've had a couple occasions to ink Jack's work over the years. How did he influence you as an artist in general?
Well, he was a major influence for me getting into comics at all. I mean, I was a young comics fan, and I hadn't really thought seriously that I would end up doing comics, although I sort of fell into it. I mean, my first attempt at doing any sorts of actual comics was in a fanzine by Marv Wolfman when I was in high school. I think Marv may
Hold on a second. Can you hear him in the back? Steve, can you get a little closer to me?
Okay. My first attempt at doing any sort of comics was in a fanzine put out by Marv Wolfman when I was in high school. And I think Marv may have been in high school at the time too, I don't know. This was like 1967. Anyway, as a young comics fan, I was a huge fan of Jack Kirby. And the first convention I ever went to was the San Diego Comic-Con of 1971, because Jack Kirby was going to be there. And various interactions. I had sent samples of my young fledgling work to DC and got a response from Carmine Infantino, who told me that Jack Kirby was doing his own comics in Southern California and I should send stuff to him. I mean, this wasn't actually true, but I did it anyway, and I sent samples off to Jack Kirby, and I got a very nice response from him, as he always did with people, encouraging me to keep it up, and you know, he would always say, someday you're going to be better than I am. And of course, we all sort of took that with a grain of salt, because we knew that wasn't going to happen. Anyway, many years later at Marvel, the opportunity to ink a couple of Jack's covers came up, and I think getting into dealing with Jack's relationship with Marvel is, what, second or third time around, whatever that was. Jack wanted to keep all the artwork himself, that the inkers wouldn't get a percentage of it. So they offered a thing where You could ink 2 covers of his. And of course, everyone immediately volunteered for this. And I managed to have the opportunity to ink an issue, or a cover of Machine Man and a cover of Devil Dinosaur. And one of them was printed, and the other one was considered, I mean, what I heard was Stan just thought it was too weird, so it wasn't printed. But I think Marv might have been the editor of that.
He thinks you were the editor of Devil Dinosaur,
Or just,
this is executive editor of Devil Dinosaur.
or he was
inked the cover that wasn't used of Jack's.
of the Machine Man.
Machine Man. Oh, Machine Man.
Not that you would necessarily remember this, but just
I'm
one
sure
cover.
that I was probably that, but you know, when at that point in Marvel,
I think it was
you
78.
were just an editor there. You got a name even if you didn't touch the book. So you got that credit anyway. So, though I remember Devil Dinosaur to some degree, also because it's now a cartoon. Everything
Yes.
Jack did
Yes.
is a cartoon. Devil Dinosaur is on the Disney Channel.
Yes, it's amazing.
And it's pretty weird. It's a really weird show. It's Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. That's what it's called.
Yes, yes, fabulous. Anyway, so I got to ink 2 of Jack's covers, which was one of my young fanboy goals, was to work with Jack Kirby at least once in real time, as I like to think of it.
There are people who, when they had a chance to ink Jack on a 1 or 2 time basis, you could see that they went and studied Joe Sinnott before they did that. You didn't look to me like you didn't do that, like you just decided to ink it like Steve Laylaw.
It took me a few tries before I felt I could reasonably ink Jack stuff. It's a tricky thing trying to figure out what needed fixing, what didn't, because, well, I can't really explain the nature of inking in a few sentences, but I just tried to make it look as good as I could without copying Joe Sinnott, and tried to keep as much of Jack in there as I could.
Who was your favorite Jack Kirby inker?
It tended to vary from period to period. I mean, Jack's work was constantly evolving. In the 50s, I loved the stuff that Jack inked himself. As a kid, I loved the stuff that Dick Ayers was doing. To my mind, the earliest Fantastic Fours inked by Dick Ayers was fabulous. Then again, when Joe Sinnott started inking, took over the inking, that was even better. And at a certain point, I think Jack's pencils got so stylized that when Mike Royer took over, to my mind, at that point in time, he was the perfect inker for Jack. So it tended to evolve over time. So, if that makes any sense.
John, you wanted to say something?
I did. Steve, there's it's an Atlas, first issue special. There was that first issue was Kirby's Atlas character. And there's an unused Atlas image, and I've seen a copy of the pencils, but there's an inked version by you.
Yes.
Do you remember what was that? Was it just a rejected page or an unused cover?
That was an unused cover, and I can't remember who, it might have been a Greg Theakston project or something like that, but I inked a copy of that Atlas cover, and it was printed somewhere. But
That was done well after it was
yes,
drawn.
yes,
Okay.
it was, like I said, it wasn't done in real time with Jack Kirby. I got to work with Jack 3 times